And now I'd like to start this event by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands Writing New South Wales is situated. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which Varuna stands, as well as the traditional custodians of all the lands you're joining us from today. Feel free to make your own acknowledgement of country in the chat box if you would like to do that. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's guests from Varuna the Writers' House, Executive Director Veechi Stuart and Creative Director Amy Sambrooke. Veechi, I thought we might start by talking about the history of Varuna. Can you tell us how we came to have this amazing resource for writers?
Oh, yes, I can. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that Varuna sits on Darug and Gundungurra land, and to acknowledge our elders past and present also. It's a lovely story about Varuna. So it started with Eleanor and Eric Dark in the 1930s, who made Varuna their home, and they built the big house of Varuna. And in the late 1930s, they also built Eleanor's little studio there. And for Eleanor Dark was one of Australia's most prominent prominent novelists at the time, a female novelist to boot. And so she's a much adored Australian literary figure, but she did always struggle to find the time and space to write. It was one of the reasons she had that little studio built for her in the garden. When Eleanor and Eric passed away, they left their house to Mick Dark, and Mick Dark, it had been Mick Dark's family home for all his life, but he knew that he didn't really want to go back and live there. But he also knew he didn't want to see it all carved up and subdivided or sold. So he called a community meeting and he asked the people of the Blue Mountains, what do you think should happen to Varuna? This was in the late 1980s. And it was a couple of ideas came through, but one of the ideas that emerged was for Varuna to be a place for writers, a retreat for writers. And the moment that was suggested for Mick, it really resonated for him because he knew just how hard it had been for his mum to find that time and space to write. And so in 1989, the first residents came to Varuna. Actually, it was 1990 when they first came, so it was incorporated in 1989. 1990, the first writers came to Varuna. And from the moment the first writers arrived, it was like Varuna didn't miss a beat. So until COVID, in fact, until we had a temporary closure during COVID, the house had 30 years of unbroken residencies from writers. That's 5 writers at a time in residence at Varuna. And it's become a real haven, I think, for Australian literature and for Australian writers. For so many writers, it's a real milestone in their career. When they arrive at Varuna, they know that they've been recognised as a writer. So it's a really important thing. And look, there's one more thing that I'd just like to say about Mick Dark, because I think it's really interesting in terms of Varuna, is that Mick Dark was not a wealthy man. It wasn't like he had a whole lot of properties and then he inherited the house from his mum and dad. He was a man of not much means. And so for him to give away Varuna to the writers of Australia was a really significant act of generosity. And I like to think that spirit of generosity, that feeling of generosity runs through the heart of what Varuna is and what Varuna does. And it's the spirit of generosity of what the writers share with each other when they're in residence as well.
It's an amazing legacy of generosity, as Veechi says, and also of literary heritage. Amy, for you as the creative director, how much do you think about that legacy in terms of planning activities and programs for Varuna?
That's a great question, Jane. And I think the answer is I think about it every day. And it's I mean, I just think maybe 3 weeks ago, we had a writer come in, and she let me know that every time she comes back, she kisses the banister when she arrives. So there's all these little ways that the writers show us just how much they love Varuna. So it would be impossible to ignore that. There's just this amazing legacy, but it's carrying forward into everything that we do. So yeah, I think it is really present. And I think through what we certainly attempt to do with the programs that bring writers to Varuna is to really to be generous, to try to create more opportunities for people, for writers. We're looking for the best Australian writers, whether you've written 10 books or whether you haven't written your first one yet. We're always looking to create opportunities and to try to find ways to lift people up and to make connections between writers, but also with publishers and you know, just really to support people on their writing journey wherever they may be. So it does imbue everything that we do. And that's part of the beauty of it. It's a quirky place with this amazing history. But it is that initial act of generosity, I think, but there's something magical about Varuna, and it's possibly that initial act of generosity hangs around and means that everybody who comes to Varuna gets a little bit of that and a little bit of that magic. It's a place where work is shared. It's very special. And I can see in the list that there's a bunch of people joining us today who have been in residence too. So it'd be interesting to hear from them later.
Yes, and if people would like to share stories of their time at Varuna in the chat box, you know, please feel free to do that. I know some of the writers who've been there have claimed to see the ghost of Eleanor, or indeed Dr. Eric, in the house. I remember Mick telling me a story years ago about a writer who was sleeping in his parents' bedroom in the house, who said that she had woken up in the middle of the night and seen Eleanor in the room. And Mick replied, "Oh yes, I've seen her in the room too." And the writer got very excited about this and said, "Oh really, tell me about it." And he said, "Well, not for quite some time." Which was
I remember 1 week, it was midsummer and it was very, very hot. And we had, like, every now and then somebody will say something like they felt a spirit or they felt an energy, whatever. But this week we'd had a run of people saying they had heard or felt something in the house. And I was beginning to go, "Oh, this is something." And it was so hot, and I was standing outside the little shed that's our office, and I was idly gazing at the house and the roof of the house. And then something caught my eye, and out of the chimney crept this very fat, hot possum. And yeah, it was clearly we had a possum living in the roof.
So the haunting spirit of the house. Yeah.
That's right.
Probably up there working on his poetry or something, though.
Nice.
The Varuna's been operating for 30 years now. Veechi, how would you say it's changed over that time, or has it changed?
Well, I think some things are really constant. And is it worth me just saying what it is, the core, or how the residencies are at Varuna? Possibly not everybody knows that, but at any one time we have 6 writers in residence. It used to be 5, but a year and a half ago we had a 6th studio built. And so these writers come together for 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks on different kinds of fellowships. And the idea of a residency is generally at the heart of it. It really is that time and space to write. So at Varuna, we facilitate that as much as possible. So we provide all meals, breakfast and lunch. And then it's quite lovely because every evening a chef comes in and cooks dinner, and everybody comes down and shares that dinner together. And that's the gathering time in the evening, often the time where writers will share their work. That's the element, I think, that's been really constant at Varuna since its inception. But what's changed in Varuna, I mean, maybe particularly in the last 6-7 years, is the capacity of Varuna has grown to include a lot more community programs, and when COVID hit, a lot more online programs. So we do a lot more professional development for writers with masterclasses and other online programs. And we will probably circle back to talk about it a bit more, but in 2019, we also ran our first Blue Mountains Writers Festival. We had done smaller satellite festival events and collaboration as part of Sydney Writers Festival in the years before that, but that was our first year doing our own independent Writers Festival. So it's that kind of collaborative professional development with writers that is has been a change at Varuna, in that it's really, we're doing a lot more of it than we ever have done. Do you think that's right, Amy? Have I missed anything about how Varuna might have changed in these 30 years? What do you reckon?
I think that there'd be some bohemian stories from the early days. So I think
True.
there's probably there might have been a bit more latitude for some different things to be going on 30 years ago in the house to what there can reasonably be these days. But yeah.
I feel as though I should definitely ask about that.
Well, you know, one thing we do know is that back in the earlier days of Varuna, that you could sort of just elect to bring your partner with you, or bring somebody with you anyway, just to stay with you for the week. So I think it did operate in a different kind of way in the early years.
Just while we're talking about the legacy, I noticed somebody's put in the chat box a question about the name Varuna. Would one of you like to tell us where the name comes from?
Amy, can I be rusty on that?
Yeah, I think the answer is that we don't entirely know why it's called Varuna, but that it is an Indian god of the oceans or of water.
And it's a name that was chosen by Eleanor and Eric, wasn't it? So,
oh, you nodded, and I thought they inherited the name with the house. So when they bought the house, it was already called Varuna.
ah,
The original house, because there was a small cottage on the site, which I think they might have briefly lived in it, but they did knock that down to build the house.
So in short, we're pretty sketchy on that one. We might need to brush up on that, Amy.
well, I knew it was an Indian god, but
yeah,
that's about all I knew too. So you mentioned the Blue Mountains Writers Festival, and tickets are on sale at the moment for this year's festival, back after COVID. Amy, tell us about the program for this year's festival.
Oh, you'll get it here first. Yeah. We've just announced the headliners so far, just a couple of them. So we've got quite a mix. As you mentioned, we're back after, it's actually 2 years of COVID cancellations, where we'd planned the whole festival both years and then had to pull the pin just before announcing it. So we've tried to honour commitments to writers who we had booked in those years, also alumni who've got more recent books, and then we also have some true literary stars. So so we've got Helen Garner, we've got Tom Keneally coming. I'm just thinking who I can give away. We haven't announced some of them yet, but
I think this is a select group. They're going to be announced on Thursday. So cone of silence, everybody.
We have Ellen Van Neven coming. We have Tony Birch. There's actually quite a number of First Nations writers who'll be joining. Who else have we got? We've got Costa coming so Costa from Gardening Australia will actually deliver a major address on the environment. So we do an event every year called the Mick Dark Talk for the Future. Ordinarily it sits at a different time of year to the festival, but because of COVID, it's just been tricky. So we've decided to combine them for this year. So Costa will be doing that as a major event. And much more. So it's based in the Carrington Hotel in Katoomba. So there'll be, I think there's about, right, Veechi, there's 30 odd writer sessions to come and
43.
watch. 43.
That's why you're feeling tired. 43 of the sessions, plus 5 special events, plus 9 workshops, 11 workshops.
Children's program, and ABC Radio in Sydney are supporting the festival, as are Western Sydney University and the Blue Mountains Cultural Centre and libraries as well. So it will be actually a much bigger festival than we've ever done before this time around. And just I think that possibly for some of you that have joined today, you might be interested to look at the writing workshops, because they are they're all up on our website now, and those are that they could well be for general community members or people who are just sort of aspirational about writers, but for those of you who have got projects underway, I think they would actually be of interest. We've got people that are really familiar to Writing New South Wales. We've got Emily Maguire running a workshop, Rick Morton, we've got Felicity Plunkett running a workshop too. There's lots there. So we encourage you to go and have a look.
Oh, and at risk of sounding a bit salesy, the early bird passes on at the moment do include a free workshop. So if you book early, then you get a free workshop as part of your ticket. So, and can I talk about the Skyway? I can, can't I? Because that's public. So the Skyway is the silly event for this year's festival, in that we're going to have 2 events in a cable car balanced over the Jamison Valley. So you're going to ride out over the valley, and then the cable car will stop, and then the event will take place while everybody is suspended over the Jamison Valley. And there's going to be a bit of music and poetry and improvised story making with James Valentine and Chris Hammer, and also James Valentine and Nardi Simpson, and then a bit of food and wine, because why would you go in the cable car without first having had a drink of champagne? I think this is a fair question.
So not for people with vertigo, that one.
No, it's not for everybody.
Amy, in talking about the program and the Mick Dark Lecture, you touched, I think, on another aspect of the legacy of the Dark family, which was a very strong commitment to the environment and protecting the environment. Is that also something you think about in programming for Varuna, about honouring that legacy as well? Yeah,
definitely. Mick Dark was a lifelong member of the Blue Mountains Conservation Society and really active in fighting for the Blue Mountains and beyond. And the Dark family, I mean, Mick's wife Jill is she pops into Varuna quite regularly, and she is still involved in all sorts of advocacy in the mountains for the environment, and is a very, very renowned twitcher. And so it definitely, right through the Dark family, there is that strong interest in the environment. And for us, that gives us such a great remit to be able to do programming that honours that legacy. So every year we do run the Mick Dark Talk for the Future, which is deliberately an event that is about the environment or about climate. But it also does mean that we look for, increasingly are looking for opportunities to do programming about environmental writing or climate or activist writing, or just to try to find connections within all of that too, because it is so important to all of us. But yeah, definitely it fits with Varuna. And how could we ignore it too? Both where we're located, where we are in a tiny ribbon of towns going across the incredible Blue Mountains. So just on either side of Varuna is the most amazing country, amazing bush. We all get out into it all the time, and it's part of coming to Varuna as well, I think, is getting out into that, going for walks and experiencing the beauty of where we're located. So it just makes absolute sense for us to be doing more in that area as well.
Veechi, obviously what Varuna's known best for is the fellowships. Can you just tell people who might not know what the range of fellowships that Varuna offers is?
Sure. Our core fellowship each year, which only just closed, is the Varuna Residential Fellowships. So approximately 30 fellowships are awarded each year in that round. So that's our biggest round of fellowships. And they are always awarded on artistic merits. So some of you might be interested to know that we always ensure that there's no identifying names when we're assessing our fellowships. So even the bios, we ask people not to make it particularly specific. So our primary criteria for awarding those fellowships is always artistic merit, and it's always fascinating to see who is awarded those fellowships. So that's Varuna's main round. And then we partner with quite a few of the state-based writing centres. Writers centres. So we partner with Writing New South Wales, Writing South Australia, Writing Queensland, the New England Writers Centre and the South Coast Writers Centre to offer annually 1 or 2 or 3 fellowships in partnership with the writers' centres. Then we have a handful of fellowships that are partnering with publishers or with agents. So each year we have a partnership with a firm. And if any of you are interested, if any of you write crime, that's going to be opening really shortly, that fellowship. So like with Firm and Scribe, the model's really fun, actually, so that we award typically 3 or 4 fellowships, and those writers come and they spend a week at Varuna with editors from the publishing company. So with 2 editors from Scribe or 2 editors from a firm. And it's like publishing boot camp. So you're working on your manuscript with your editors every day. And there's quite a few people here I can see, I know, who've been published and had that experience. And you would know how rare it is to have, even when you've been published many times, to have that level of connection and feedback from a publisher, to be with, from an editor, to be there every day, getting that fantastic feedback. And then there's the option, Scribe or a firm have the option to publish work out of that program. And that's an outcome that's happened for many, many writers who've come through those programs. There's also our Publishing Pathways program, where there's 2 awarded each year, 1 with a publisher and 1 with an agent, and Ultimo Press and Left Bank Literary Agency, where there's a mentoring payment awarded to the writer, as well as a week's residency, as well as a consultation with the publisher or agent. And in both cases for this year's Publishing Pathways fellowships, the publisher and agent have given contracts to those writers. So they're really great outcomes for that program. We've got our First Nations fellowships. That's actually just been happening this week. So that's when 6 First Nations writers come together at Varuna for a week. We have, gosh, there's so many. I'm just trying to think. We've got our Writers Space Fellowship, and those are for writers with disability. So that's 6 week-long residencies at Varuna, or fortnight or 2-week residencies, and in parallel 6 online residencies, and they run together. There's Arts and Tea residency, not quite so relevant to everyone here. What have I missed, Amy? I'm just rattling these off.
There's also there's partnerships with say Western Sydney University and Griffith Review. Up until this year, there's been the Next Chapter partnership with the Wheeler Centre as well. So yeah, there's a lot that goes on.
Yeah.
I should say that the Writing New South Wales fellowships are open at the moment, and if anybody's interested in applying for those, there are 2 fellowships, 1 general and 1 for a writer under 30. The link is in the chat box if you're interested in those. Veechi, you mentioned online residencies. What is an online residency?
Well, they're quite quirky, as you might expect from Varuna. So we started them in COVID, and they typically go for 1 to 2 weeks. And what we were trying to do is, as much as possible, when we were all locked down and all not able to connect with one another, try and recreate that feeling of Varuna as much as possible. And they were so popular that we have continued them beyond lockdown. But what happens is each day has an element of structure. So it might be, we have daily shut up and write sessions, so 1 hour focused writing time. But we have several, typically 3 or 4 reading sessions where writers get together online and share their work, reading to each other and getting feedback about their work. We have Q&A sessions in that fortnight where we ask a well-known writer like Marcus Zuzak or Alexis Wright, or somebody who's, really well known in their field, also international guests, to come and just spend the time with those writers. And we really those sessions for the writers, they can ask those authors anything they want. Oh, and really importantly, we have a maximum of 8 and more commonly 6 for these online residencies. So they're small, intimate groups. And as well as that, each writer has 1 or 2, usually 2 one-on-one consultations with a mentor. And sometimes that mentor is a straight up writing mentor, but other times we've been able to connect the writers with a publishing house. So it's a consultation with a publishing house. So there's quite a lot of different elements in our online residency, but I think we actually call them lamplight residencies. And the idea was this picture of you walking down the Varuna pathway at night and you look up at the big house and everybody's in their rooms. And there's all these lights in the windows, and these lights, when you look up at the house, it's like this connection, the connection of being writers. And so what we're trying to do is go, let's connect. Let's not worry about distance. Let's find ways to connect. So we call them the lamplight residencies. And that's our aim, to find ways for people to connect and for people to be able to share their work and listen to others' work and feel, I guess, the benefit. It can be quite isolating being a writer, can't it? You're there on your own and you're scribbling away and you go, is this shit? Is it okay? What is it? You kind of wanting that feedback. And it's a way of breaking that isolation and in its place having connection and sharing.
And are you planning to continue those in the post-COVID world, if there ever is a post-COVID world?
Is there going to be? Yes, and particularly with our international partners. So doing it where it's half Australian writers and half Irish writers, or half Australian and half New Zealand. And Amy, you look like you were.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, we just finished one last week. We were we've just run a program for LGBT QIA plus writers over 65. So a seniors writing program, which was that mix. So it was a 2-week online residency. So it was that combination. I think what's important also is it is about bringing people together, and it is about mentoring and writer development and the readings. But I think for a lot of writers, I think they could identify that a lot of it's about sitting down and doing it. It's about that accountability. It's about showing up every day for your writing and for the project, and that often that can be quite hard to do in regular life. So just to find that space and to be held to account over a certain period of time, so that you are going to be sitting down and showing up to your work. We've found that that's a really important ingredient to those programs as well. The Shut Up and Write, the online Shut Up and Write sounds completely crazy, where that's a program where really we kicked it off in the middle of Melbourne's awful lockdown, and that was just a way for our alumni to get together. But we would just gather in a Zoom just like this, and we just got the writers to commit to those sort of Pomodoro blocks, the 25-minute blocks of writing. They would some would sit down and they'd even leave their camera on while they worked. So they'd literally be working like this, so that they felt that others in the group would see if they ducked off to make too many cups of tea or anything like that. So it was that sense of accountability. But just out of that, which is a very silly idea in a way, we know that some of those writers have written virtually whole books as part of just doing that and making that commitment to themselves and to each other. So that's a key part of it as well, I think.
Veechi mentioned before, Amy, that the applications for Varuna Fellowships are judged on artistic merit alone. So I assume that's based on an extract from the work that's being written. How does the judging process work?
Yeah, so generally we ask for between 7,000 and 10,000 words, and that's if it's prose. Of course, it's different if it's poetry, or I did see in the chat someone was asking about picture books and things, and depending on the program, different genre maybe. Like the call that we're about to do for the Affirm program is crime and thriller writing. And that's so we're asking for 7,000 to 10,000 words. other programs like the Varuna Residential Fellowships that we do every year that Veechi mentioned, that's much more open to all genre. So so for that one, there's all different requirements. So I would encourage people to have a look at the websites for the particular programs. But in general, they are judged on artistic merit. And I would just say that a tip for everybody might be to really, we usually also ask about a work plan, and that I think just put time into thinking about that, because what we're looking for is that the writers know what needs to be done or what they need help with. So it is about, yes, I know that I've got to do X thousand words or to finish it, but it's kind of that understanding of where the work sits and what needs to be done to get it to that finished state. So I think that's often something that that could get overlooked in that application process, but that it is important to think about. And in general, with the, I shouldn't say in general, because all the programs are slightly different, but we appoint assessors for each program, so there's always different people. So say with like the Affirm program that's coming up, the assessors we appoint for this program are different to the assessors who have assessed it previously. So there's always different people that we're working with. For that program and the Scribe program, those assessors will be asked to read all of those submissions and come up with an agreed shortlist, which then go off to the publisher for their final selection. So those assessment processes tend to take a little while. So if for those of you who have applied for our programs, that's kind of why, because there's this whole process that needs to happen. Everything gets read by at least 2 assessors, and that's across all of our programs. So all of that needs to happen, and then often there's this other process that happens where it does go off to the in the end, the publishers or whoever we're working with on that program.
So would you say that, you know, for the assessors, it comes down to the quality of the writing plus the work plan and being convinced that people are going to get value from being at Varuna? Is that?
Yep.
Those are the 2 elements of the assessment.
Yeah.
Are there any things, you've given people a tip to really think about that work plan, are there any things that people do in their applications that they shouldn't be doing that, you know, make it less likely that they're going to be successful?
Oh, that's a tricky question.
I think, Amy, that one thing that we find is if something's really full of typos, then that it really does create a barrier. I mean, our assessors are looking for a unique voice and they're looking for stories that are relevant, but the craft of writing is important too. So if you have, and it's amazing how often I'll open a document and I'll see spelling mistakes and grammatical mistakes, more than one, like several on the first page. And if that's not your strength, getting somebody to help you with copy editing on your submission is a good idea, or even using a tool like Grammarly will be enormously beneficial. So that does trip people up, and it would be a tip to spend time on that, I think.
It's kind of similar, isn't it, to submitting to anything. You need to do it professionally and make sure that it's your best quality. You know, it's the best you can make it before you press submit. Yeah. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience soon, but before I do that, Veechi, where do you see Varuna going in the future? Where do you think you'll be in 10 years?
Where do you think? Well, I think that there's some initiatives that we've been working on. I'd love to see them more consolidated. So the festival, we're really expanding that this year. I'd love to see that settled and an absolute fixture on Australia's literary festival circuit. We are hoping to build a new building in the grounds of Varuna in that car park area as a community building. So we've got an infrastructure application, funding application in at the moment. And what that would enable us to do is be more porous with the community, have more writing groups, and small, whether it's events, small book launches, and more connection with the writers in residence. So a writer in residence comes, they've got a new book out. We could have a Thursday evening drinks down in this community space so that people could come and hear that writer talk about their work. So a much more regular community activity would be great, and a building, to have a dedicated building, would really facilitate that, because the house we do try and keep as a really quiet space for the writers in residence. And I think there's projects that are on the boil that I'd love to see more consolidated, and I really think they will happen the next 10 years. So our international program is really just beginning, but there's so much interest and so much energy around that, those exchanges with Scotland and Ireland and Shanghai and New Zealand, and maybe with Writing in New South Wales and India, and hopefully the States. So I think that it's inevitable that those international relationships will grow and consolidate over time, because there's just so much energy and enthusiasm behind them. And what do you reckon, Amy, in 10 years' time? What do you reckon would change?
I'd like to think that the heart of it doesn't change, that the experience of coming to Varuna remains the same. So while there are all these great, like, there's almost endless opportunity in a way of all the things that we can do, and that these are really exciting things, and I agree with all of that. But I think that for writers coming to Varuna, I'd love to think that it stays almost identically the same, because there's something so lovely about it, and that continuity where we know we have writers that come and they've been visiting for 20 years, and they just fall straight back into that groove. It's like it's a second home. It's a place to come and write. So I think it's about both of those things. It's about that growth or new opportunities, but it is about maintaining that heart.
Just listening to you both, and particularly Veechi talking about the idea of a community space, I guess there's always a bit of a tension for Varuna, which has a national role in being a refuge for writers, but it also has a role within the Blue Mountains community. And how do you balance those two things?
It's the tension that's always been there. I remember when I first started working for it, it was the puzzle, and I think it is a puzzle for everybody. But I think where Amy and I have been able to navigate that, because there's so many different ways you could explore that, is things that benefit both. So, for example, the Writers' Festival is a community endeavour. It's there in Katoomba, but we know it's giving our alumni a lot of opportunities to present their work. So it's trying to find both. And I was fortunate enough to visit both Cove Park in Scotland and Tyrone Guthrie Island in June. And it was really interesting seeing how these similar residencies in Scotland and Ireland navigated this tension between having a national presence and then having a community presence too. And they also have small community things, but a lot of their work in the community is also providing opportunities for the writers to have professional appearances or presenter fees and similar paid opportunities, because we all know how hard it is for writers to actually make a living in Australia. So when we can create opportunities for writers to earn money, that's also something that Varuna's keen to do.
Yeah, that's very important, I think, for all the organisations supporting writers, isn't it, to be doing that? Yes. Do you have views on that, Amy, that question of being both for the local community and for a wider national community?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tension, but it's a strength too. I think that we see that with when we can actually run a festival, fingers crossed for COVID, we see like the Blue Mountains local community want to embrace Varuna and the writers and really get behind it. So I think, the Blue Mountains is an incredible creative community. And we're blessed with many artists and musicians and writers that live in our local community. So yeah, it is a tension. I think Varuna, it perhaps at different times in its history has run different kinds of programs, and I'm thinking maybe even in the last few years, like pre-COVID, we were able to do school programs and things in our local community. We ran this kind of milkshake club for high school writers, which was quite a funny little old-fashioned program that we ran, but it was so lovely, and we'd love to get back to doing those sorts of things once we are a little bit more settled, because I think we've only just been able to get back in the groove of life after the last couple of years of upheaval. So I think that there's all sorts. It's kind of like Varuna could be it could almost be go in any direction. Like it's got so much potential. So it is attention. Our resources are limited, but we do try our best.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, and there should be a few of those, I think, to run through. I noticed that Desney had asked about the wheelchair accessible room and whether you had the capacity for a support worker to stay if somebody needed that.
It depends. So everyone's circumstances are different. So we've had a few writers come and stay in that accessible studio. It's called the Jera Studio, and a couple of them have had been supported by their partner, who's welcome to come and stay in that room. But we have, for others who have come with a support worker there, we can help arrange very nearby accommodation, and even in the house next door, we've got an arrangement there where we can rent out a lovely space in that house. So everyone's circumstances are different, so we just help to make it happen case by case.
So people just need to let you know their access requirements.
Exactly. Yeah.
Jennifer's asked what kinds of stories the assessors are most interested in. Is there anything in general that you can say about that, or does it vary too much?
That's tricky. I think it does vary. Yeah, every program has a different call out focus, I suppose, but they're looking for a great voice and an original idea, and I think that sense of possibility, and that it is a project that can be completed and that could benefit from that dedicated time to focus on it.
And here's another tip: when somebody says in their work plan, this is my third and final draft and I'm really delighted with it, and my work plan is that I'll just be putting the finishing touches on it while I secure a contract, that's not always the best approach, because our assessors are looking for writers who they know will be open to feedback. So you might, it's okay if it's a first draft, it's fine if it's a fourth or final draft, but I think it's always good in your work plan to acknowledge that you are open to working on your manuscript and having further development on your manuscript. So that's a bit of a tip for your work plan. And I noticed somebody else actually asked how many applications we receive on average for one of these programs. It depends. So for Varuna Residential Fellowship, we typically receive about 450 applications, and that's about 30 spots. So it's just less than 10%. But then other more specific rounds will have maybe a higher acceptance ratio. So our writers with disability round is probably closer to 10 or 15% accepted. So it is really highly competitive. Every now and then, and if you subscribe to our mailing list, you will get notified about this, but every now and then we'll have an invited residency call out, which is slightly less competitive. So that is for coming to Varuna not on a fellowship, but just to actually stay on a residency. And so we'll typically do a call out every 12 months to 18 months for that. and that's a higher percentage acceptance rate. We probably would offer 20 places out of every 60 applications for that.
Those places where the writer is paying the cost.
The writer pays the cost on those.
Yeah. So that's a more easier to get, but there's a cost involved for the writer. Yeah.
Yes. So just to be clear, I guess all the spots at Varuna you have to apply for. You can't just ring and ask to book. So it is application only at Varuna. But we're keen to hear from everybody, of course. Yeah.
Kate's asked a question about the past involvement of Varuna with publishers, where there would be open call outs to Varuna alumni to submit a work in progress or completed manuscript to a participating publisher. And she's asking, is that still happening? She can't remember seeing anything like that since COVID.
Yeah, sure. And hi, Kate. Thanks for the question. So that program you're talking about is the Publisher Introduction Program, which has been really replaced by the Pitch Me program that Veechi was speaking about earlier, where we're in partnership with, well, the last round of that was in partnership with Ultimo Press and Left Bank Literary, and that was open to alumni who'd been awarded a recent fellowship. So for the moment, that's the program that sits in that space. That broader program, it just needed a bit more work, that program. It's sometimes it worked well, sometimes it didn't work so well, and we just wanted to sit and reflect on whether there are more effective ways that we can be connecting with publishers. So for the moment, it's the Pitch Me program. So check that one out.
And we might be able to put a link to that in the chat box for people. I'm just scrolling through the questions to see if there's anything else. No, we've still got time for a few more questions. So if you have one, please put it in the chat box. I was wondering if you could share with us the kind of feedback that you get from writers who come to Varuna. What do they tell you about it?
People love it at Varuna. So, but I think the core bit of feedback from a writer's perspective is people find they are enormously productive. And I think whether the people in this forum today, whether you think you might come to Varuna or not, I think it's a salient lesson about just how much you can get done if you give yourself 7 days and 7 nights unbroken time. It is, of course, wonderful it'd be one thing to go and book an Airbnb and do that. And it's, of course, wonderful to be together with your peers and have that wonderful sharing. But nonetheless, I think the thing that happens at Varuna, because everything's provided, you don't need to shop for food, you don't need to care for anybody, you don't need to cook. You basically, the only thing that's there to do is write. And that is a big element of what makes the writers feel that it's been incredibly, enormously productive. And often it's carrying away that insight when they leave Varuna of, wow, I just have to give myself space and permission to do this, and look what can happen.
Do you have anything to add to that, Amy?
I think, well, I was just going to say that often the writers that come to Varuna for the first time, like if you've never done a residency before, I think it can be quite daunting, and that writers can put a lot of pressure on themselves about, because the selection process could happen 4, 5, 6 months before they actually come to Varuna. So they've been selected and they know that it's coming up, and they've got all those months to just dump the pressure on about how much they're going to get done. And I'll get 20 or 30,000 words written, or I'll do like a whole edit of the book or whatever. I'll just be sitting down and writing this enormous amount of work. And I think it's also important that writers feel that, like what Veechi is saying about being nurtured and looked after, and to take a little bit of that pressure off when they actually arrive, because it is also about, like any creativity, is about giving yourself that space for possibility. So we really encourage the writers to have a sleep in and to do some reading and to go out and go for a walk each day, enjoy the beautiful place where we are. And I think that all that nourishing environment actually creates this enormous well of possibility for people's work. And it's often when people are walking or going up the street to get a coffee, or that they have this epiphany about their work because they have let go of some of those expectations. And I think also a writer was actually just saying it to us this week, that the last time he came to Varuna, he didn't get as much done as he wanted to in the week of actual words on the page, but that when he got home, he couldn't stop writing. He'd been so inspired, and it had unlocked things in his head and in his work, and that it just flowed for the weeks following. So it is just about creating that space and seeing what happens.
Helene has asked whether you have any focus on the editing process at Varuna.
We don't currently have a residential editorial program. There has been a REP program, a residential editorial program in the past. It is something we'd like to reinstitute, but at the moment we don't have any fellowships or programs specifically around editing. But watch this space, then it might appear. So yeah.
And Pete has asked whether you and I would guess the answer is no, given that it's all on artistic merit, but do you have a percentage of places in the fellowship program for first-time writers?
So the answer is no, but the outcomes would be like, it's not as if it's only people who have published extensively that get those fellowships. So kind of like the proof is in the pudding, I suppose, of that process, that particularly that big round, the Varuna Residential Fellowships, the breadth of who's getting awarded those fellowships, it every single time it ranges from, you know, someone who's never published anything to quite experienced writers. So we just would really encourage you to give it a go.
Yeah. And there's a related question I can see just below saying, do first drafts have a chance of being accepted for a fellowship, or should one wait till later drafts? And look, it all depends on the first draft. And I did allude before to, it's good to have something that is as free of typos as you can make it. But if you've got a really strong idea and a strong voice, sometimes, you know, a first draft will be awarded a fellowship because it will just pop out of the page and the assessors will be really excited about the originality of the work.
Yeah, and often because it's only an extract, obviously, that's being submitted,
yeah,
inevitably it's not going to be about the structure of the piece, which is often the thing that bedevils the first draft. It's more about the voice and the language,
yeah,
which can be very present in a first draft, can't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Amy, you gave a few tips for people to how they could make best use of their time at Varuna in letting go of expectations. Does either of you have other things that you've observed that make it work best or not work for writers when they're actually at Varuna?
I love it when the writers are sharing work. So we don't force that to happen, but we do really see the benefit of that, and sharing work in a structured way and a safe way. So I think all of us here would know that receiving feedback can actually throw you off course if it's if it's delivered in the wrong way, or if it's feedback that you weren't seeking. It can really actually have the opposite effect, particularly when it's something like a creative work. You're so vulnerable, and I think that's part of the beauty of Varuna, is that even if you have published 10 books, you're at Varuna because you're writing something new, or you're grappling with something. So you're in almost exactly the same state of creative vulnerability as someone who's writing their first work. So that kind of leveling out of that vulnerability is important to recognize, that everyone's in that space. But what we really love to see is when the writers are getting together in the evening and that they're sharing an excerpt of something, and it could be something they've written that day, and it's like, oh, I've been struggling with this scene, and can I just get some feedback on, like, do you think I've introduced too many characters too quickly? Or like when the writer who's seeking feedback is framing tight questions for people to respond to. So it's not that open-ended, all in, let's just rip this thing apart. Like, that's not going to help anybody. So what we really like to see is those really constructive conversations happening. And most weeks that does happen, and it is just a gorgeous thing to be around. We've had, I think 3-4 weeks ago, we had a writer that was assembling a poetry collection physically all over the floor of Varuna. Like, so in the day you'd go over there and things are all out in different orders. And I know that all the other writers in residence were popping down at different times of the day and just giving advice or reading things. And, you know, it's just, so when it is that lovely collaborative feel, there's a lot to be said for that.
There's a really lovely comment in the chat box from Bette Spencer, who wanted to share that she was in the first intake at Varuna back in the early 90s. And she's written, it was an extraordinary thing to be in a place where writing was considered so important, and just being a writer was so valued. It was incredibly nurturing and a unique experience. Long may Varuna continue. Just a lovely testament, I think, to the work that you do.
And hello, Beth. Lovely to see
you. We do have a few more detailed questions about the application process. We've got a couple of people asking about word limits in the application process, and whether the 7,000 to 10,000 words is strictly adhered to, and kind of related to that is how would that apply to poetry?
Yeah. So it does vary a little bit from program to program. So you just do need to read the guidelines. But I have a tip about the 7,000 to 10,000 words. So we have a character limit of 10,000. You wouldn't want to go over that 10,000 words. But if you go under that 7,000 words, the feedback we've had from assessors is people go, look, I think this was really strong, but it was really hard to compare it to other applications in terms of merit, because there wasn't enough to go on. So the feedback we've had from our assessors is that when somebody only submits, say, 3,000 or 4,000 words, they say, look, I think it had potential, but it was hard to judge. So we'd really, really encourage you to try and stick into that limit, to try and give us at least 7,000 words. And poetry, it does vary, but it's usually 10 to 20 poems. So you just have a look at the guidelines for that particular fellowship. So that's not a word count thing. And then I can see another specific question is about the Pitch Me program. There's been a couple of people asking to know a bit more about that. So it is on our website. It will reopen again at the end of this year. And that's the program Amy was referring to before, where it's actually only open to Varuna Fellowship recipients from the previous 12 months. So if you've been awarded a fellowship already in the previous 12 months and you haven't found a publisher for that work, then we invite you to submit your work in its current state to us. And we share that with a publisher, Ultimo Press, and with an agent, Grace from Left Bank Literary. And then each of those, Grace and Ultimo Press, each choose one of those manuscripts for the Pitch Me program, and that's the program that includes a small budget for mentoring and a residency and a one-on-one consultation with the publisher or the agent, and then hopefully an opportunity to publish. But that is just a little bit narrower in its eligibility, and as I said, it's only open to people who've had a fellowship in the last 12 months. So
Thank you, Veechi, and thank you to both of you for the conversation today. It's been really interesting and I think informative for everybody who's come along. That is all we have time for today, unfortunately, but our next First Friday event will be on Friday the 2nd of September with Tiffany Zhao, who is the editor of The Circular. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon at another Writing New South Wales event.
Thanks, Jane. And thanks, everybody. Lovely to see you all.
Yes, thank you.